Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, now on video. Don't worry if you've been listening to the audio. Keep doing it. It's fine. But if you want to check out the video, enjoy. On this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast, I get to catch up with Mr. Regulatory David Pudwill, and we talk about IDE, Investigational Device Exemption. So get into a lot of details on this, but it's really good stuff, especially if you're considering or want to know more about whether or not an IDE is going to be necessary or the type of path that makes sense for your product. So enjoy this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. Yes, that's right. On video, that's a new addition. Folks listening to the audio version, you're still going to be able to catch that wherever you're listening to the podcast. But be sure to check out video. We're putting it out and sort of the usual suspects as well. But joining me today on the Global Medical Device Podcast is a recurring, familiar voice, Mr. Regulatory, David Pudwill. David, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I've known this, and hopefully people have already picked up that at least we have the same hairstylist. But folks, go to YouTube, type in Mr. Regulatory. David's got a ton of content that's there on a lot of things FDA related. And today we're going to dive into one of those conversations. We're going to talk about IDE. So I guess before we get too deep, David, it might be a good place to start. What is IDE? Some folks may know, but don't make an assumption here.
Yeah, it's one of those FDA acronyms. Oh, wait, that's another one. It's like so the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, terms an investigational device exemption as an IDE. Usually, this is a clinical study that you need to get in front of FDA, and that's the submission mechanism that FDA has put in place for you to go ahead and submit that information and for them to approve or disapprove your clinical study.
Okay. And folks, there are a ton of resources and links, and we'll share some of those in the text and the show notes that accompany this, but a lot of information out there. But I guess, maybe a good place or next place to go is kind of talk about when should I be considering an IDE. And I know there are some situations where I think it's more of thou shalt do IDE, and other cases where, maybe I want to. So, maybe let's expand upon that a little bit. When is it required? When is it nice to have? And those sorts of things.
Yeah, I guess if you don't mind, I'd back up a little bit and sort of say it's helpful if you're planning on conducting a clinical study to just think again, as we've talked about in some previous podcasts, about the overall landscape and sort of where you're trying to get to, what is your end goal. And FDA has a couple different programs that you can avail yourself of around early feasibility studies, if that's, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later here as well in terms of what that might look like. But if you're looking to do breakthrough kinds of products, or if you're looking to improve the safety of existing products, FDA has a couple different programs that you should think about around what they call EFS, that's early feasibility, breakthrough device designation, which gives you a couple perks, and everybody wants to be breakthrough, but not everybody's breakthrough. Right. And then what they call the Safer Technologies Program, or STEP. Yeah. So those are just to start with. As you think about the overall plan to move forward in terms of development and what you're trying to achieve, check those programs out. You're probably already doing that, but check those out and see if that's applicable. And then in terms of the actual IDE study itself, the FDA's put together a bunch of really great links for you on their CDRH Learn landing page. And there's just countless numbers of presentations and resources. Some stuff back in 2014, there were a number of presentations and things that FDA put out that are really quite useful.
Right.
And one slide in particular in there, and FDA presents it a couple times in their IDE basics presentation. You can watch the video. You can also go look at the the slideshow slides in a PDF format or something. And on page 12 there's this great little graphic, and it talks about or sort of maps out if you've got a device study that's either exempt or not exempt, and then what sort of falls into that not exempt category in terms of significant risk or non-significant risk. So first and foremost, there are a lot of clinical studies that are just exempt from IDE regulations.
And maybe elaborate a little bit. When you say exempt, I mean,
yeah,
not to assume that these terms are entirely clear to everyone. What does that mean, exempt?
Yeah, so that means you're not going to have to submit an IDE to FDA for that. And there are even some non-exempt studies where you may or may not have to submit an IDE. But under the exempt, you're going to be exempt from at least the FDA requirements around this. Depending on the context that you're doing some of this, you might still need to submit something to an IRB. But in terms of exempt studies, this is going to be commercial devices used according to their labeling. That probably wouldn't need, I wouldn't expect you to have an IRB approval for anything like that where the device is already on the market, approved for that particular type of use. A lot of diagnostic devices, because there's not a safety, a patient safety consideration depending on how you're using it, and if you're just evaluating the product against standard of care versus actually trying to inform the clinical judgment and decision making, testing of consumer preference or a modification when determining safety and effectiveness and not putting subjects at risk. Again, same kind of thing for the diagnostics. Some of these as well. There are device types that fall into some of these categories as well. You'll find certain wound care products, for instance, fall into this exempt category in terms of, or they fall into, I shouldn't say exempt, they're going to be in the non-significant risk category and not require an IDE. But for exempt, you've got veterinary devices, custom devices, and a couple other categories as well that are, let's say, practice of medicine. So you may not be on label for this particular use, but if a clinician is using it under practice of medicine, not in a study per se, that's also going to be acceptable, not require an IDE study, or if it's basic physiological research, and FDA goes into a little bit of detail there. So that's the exempt category. All of those are going to not require an IDE. And then we get into the not exempt category, and this is where, let's say, wound care devices are going to fall into the not exempt but not significant risk for certain types of products, and FDA has laid that out. And those are going to generally require IRB engagement, but not require an IDE. And even for the exempt and non-exempt, this doesn't tell you anything about whether you need an IRB engagement, but it does tell you clearly for anything that's exempt, you don't need FDA's engagement. Once you get into the non-significant risk, it's going to be a determination by an IRB about it being not significant risk, and you definitely have an IRB involved in those sorts of not exempt studies, or generally you would, and then because they're making that risk determination. And then you have what are considered significant risk studies, and the initial determination on that is going to be made by the investigation sponsor, and that might be a physician, it might be a company, and that initial determination about where you fall into the risk categorization is actually made by you if you're running the study. And then depending on what that looks like and whether you need to engage an IRB to run that, they'll then sense check that determination about, let's say, significant risk versus not significant risk. And if they disagree, then they might ask you to submit something to FDA to confirm, and you can actually get a Q submission into FDA to get FDA's determination on that.
Okay. And a couple of reactions. So exempt, not exempt. I guess clarification. This should not be confused with device classification.
No.
The same terms may be used for device classification, but these are not necessarily connected to that, correct?
So yeah, so you may require a 510K submission for a product, so it's not exempt from a 510K, but it could still be exempt from, let's say, an investigational device exemption. So yeah, that's a very good clarification. Just because you're if you're exempt from, let's say, 510K, probably you're going to find yourself in a category where you could get the device on the market without a clinical study. So it's not to say that all 510K exempt devices would be exempt from IDE requirements, but you're more likely to find a path to be exempt from IDE sort of investigational device exemption requirements if you have a 510K exempt product. But if you require a 510K, you're not 510K exempt, you still might be exempt for certain device categories from the IDE requirements.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess one follow-up on that. So if I have, I guess it's whether or not, if I have a device that's on the market, and regardless of if it's class 1, 510K exempt or 510K clearance, et cetera, there's a potential that I can still do an exempt type of clinical study. If I start to explore other indications for use, that might be part of that decision tree that makes it not exempt. So, there is sort of a decision tree that one would follow, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, and if you're looking at de novo and PMA products, I mean, the likelihood is that you're not exempt. And the likelihood is that you fall into significant risk just because of the device classifications and how you'd probably be looking to study the product. But it's going to vary based on what it is that you're studying, how it is that you're looking at it. And you could lay out scenarios where even high risk devices could fall into a not significant risk, kind of a study. And this is again where you look at certain diagnostic devices, or let's say you were testing consumer preference of a couple different available options, and you've already got your clearances. You've got a high risk device, but you have a potentially exempt study.
Sure. And I guess that's another follow-up question I wanted to explore a little bit: significant risk, non-significant risk. I believe this is still a thing. I know once upon a time, FDA had or probably has a pretty good guidance document about significant risk, not significant risk. I assume that's still a thing these days, right?
Yeah. So FDA has a lot of content out there on significant risk versus non-significant risk. Also, a lot of detail on just within the context of submissions, and this is useful for you to think about as you're headed towards, presumably, if you're going to do a clinical study, you're also looking to get a device marketed, this benefit risk determination, and sort of how to think about risk in the context of the overall process to get the device onto the market.
Yeah, I wanted to add that because I don't want people to be confused. Yes, you as device developer, manufacturer, whatever the case may be, have some part of the decision-making process as far as significant, not significant risk. But it's not like you just get to say, my device is not significant risk. There is guidance.
There's guidance. You could say that. FDA may disagree with you. Right. And so it's one of those situations where, yes, you do have some information that will guide your decision-making around what falls into significant risk, what doesn't. FDA's also laid out a couple examples of what's going to fall into, let's say, significant risk. So for instance, products that are in implant or used in supporting or sustaining human life, or of substantial importance in diagnosing, curing, mitigating, or treating disease, or preventing impairment of human health, or otherwise poses a risk. So this is just sort of some broad brush swaths of what would constitute probably a significant risk kind of a device. Yeah. And the IRB in these kinds of cases, you're generally going to be engaging with, with an IRB would be my expectation, or you've already conducted a clinical study and you've already got a device on the market for that kind of a significant risk category product, such that you know the sort of the gradations of what's going to require a study and what wouldn't. And FDA is going to be the final arbiter if there are any disputes. You don't really want to be in a position of being at odds with FDA, and FDA does have a mechanism where you can submit a QSub to them. It's the kind of thing, though, where a lot of these should be somewhat cut and dried, and sometimes even for some things that should be straightforward, an IRB will send a sponsor to FDA. And, so I was involved in looking at some of these SR, NSR determinations. Usually it's a medical doctor in that subject, area of expertise that's going to actually be looking at it, making a determination at FDA. And then you've got people who were doing what I was doing, maybe helping to drive some of the administrative, documentation around that and getting a determination back to a study sponsor. Occasionally you'd see some significant risk or non-significant risk questions come to FDA that were relatively straightforward. No, FDA is going to make the cut. It's not significant risk. And sometimes you just have a very conservative IRB. But, FDA will make those decisions both for a device being a significant risk versus, or not being a significant risk based on the objective evidence that you present to them. So the best advice I would suggest, if you're going down that path, is to make sure that you provide sufficient information to justify why, if you believe it's a not significant risk study, why that is and what your justification is, and provide as much context around that as you can, because that'll really help FDA then make that determination. And if you can get the IRB to agree with you up front, you can head that whole situation off. Because there's always a chance that FDA is going to disagree with you if you think it's not significant risk, and FDA is going to lean in general, towards a slightly more conservative judgment on gray area issues.
Yeah, I mean, the QSub, I want folks to also remember QSub and presubmission. Those are synonymous with one another. If you go to FDA with a QSub or presubmission and say, hey, do I need an IDE clinical investigation for this? If you ask that question, well, careful.
The answer is probably yes.
It's probably going to be yes. So, David's point.
Can't say always.
But David's point, do your homework, do the due diligence ahead of time, engage an IRB, and come, even after you do the due diligence, engage our IRB, go through the SR, NSR sort of decision tree and so on and so forth. There's a decent chance it still might be ambiguous. Then that's the opportunity to come to FDA. But don't just say, hey, FDA, do I need an IDE? Because to your point, they're probably going to say yes. Well,
and I've seen this kind of thing as well with in other areas primarily. I think for SR, NSR, it's going to be a little bit more objective, but there's still some level of subjectivity here. But definitely in some other areas where FDA guidance is pretty clear, you can go to FDA and ask them the question. And usually if you're asking them, that indicates to FDA that you believe there might be some ambiguity. And, so I know there are some situations within companies where your commercial team wants a clarity from FDA about something, and they're not trusting the regulatory team or something like that. As much as you can do to try to head that situation off, I mean, please do. Wherever possible, please trust your regulatory people to make good judgments about some of this stuff. Because if you push the regulatory people to ask FDA a question that should be clear cut, FDA is going to look at it and say, why are they asking? There must be something here we're missing. Yeah. Is there any reason we might think that we should give them the answer they're not looking for? Yeah. And you just put yourself in a situation where sometimes the answer should be clear cut, and it should be, let's say, that FDA doesn't need to be involved. But if you ask FDA whether they would like to be involved, they might tell you yes. Yeah. So just be prepared for that, and just don't be asking questions that you know the answer to if you can clearly document that.
For sure. Folks, I want to remind you, I'm talking to the Mr. Regulatory, David Pudwill. You can learn a ton more about him in a couple places. You could go to mrregulatory.com, MR Regulatory, all one word, no hyphens.com. As I mentioned at the beginning, you can also go to the Mr. Regulatory YouTube channel. Quite a few different episodes and videos on a lot of things. Like, some of it's really nuanced type of topics, but it's that stuff that you don't deal with every day, and you need somebody that has the expertise and knowledge, and certainly Mr. Regulatory has that. Also, while I'm taking this brief pause to remind you that Greenlight Guru medical device success platform is out there, and it is helping companies all over the world bring devices to market and keep them there. We built this platform for the medical device industry. It's been designed by actual medical device professionals. So go check it out, www.greenlight.guru. And one other exciting announcement that we just launched, we have this thing called Greenlight Guru Academy. What is this? Well, we've built out this education platform. We're going to be frequently adding some different courses and learning paths to teach you more about things like design controls and risk management and regulatory submissions and so on and so forth. So it's out there, it's available, consume it, enjoy it, and be on the lookout for exciting new courses coming soon in the Greenlight Guru Academy. All right.
And I am really happy to hear about more training opportunities and things available, because it's really been one of the reasons that I started doing any of these videos to start with, is just the quality of some of the information that's out there. FDA's got some stuff. We've talked about this in this area in particular. There's a lot of volume of information. You can go through it. I don't know that FDA has ever really condensed it well. Not that we're condensing it particularly well in this conversation either, but at some point, probably try to put together some slides that better condense. Okay, here's the map, because FDA's information is from, let's say, 2014, and maybe they'll get around to doing it. But I think at the moment they're busy with a bunch of COVID, issues. And speaking of which, there are some COVID considerations as well for investigational device exemptions and clinical studies. And I have a couple of videos on some of those topics.
Well, we'll make sure to get those links out there. But I mean, that's an interesting topic, maybe in and of itself, but maybe we'll dive into a little bit now. But, I know when COVID first, came to be and, the world kind of shut down, so to speak, there was an impact on the med device industry and there for a bit. And specifically in the area of like IDEs and clinical investigations, both here and abroad. What are these COVID IDE? See, I'm getting all the acronyms messed up, David. But what are these programs that you alluded to?
Yeah, so FDA's put out some guidances on statistical considerations, COVID specific issues that you're going to run into. You've now got some confounding factors due to having a COVID population. A lot of this was maybe a bigger impact very early on in the pandemic for ongoing studies, or for people trying to start studies and figure out how to adequately control them. There's some other considerations as well in terms of remote monitoring of studies, and different ways that you can actually collect data in the current environment, where we're trying to limit the number of in-person interactions that people have, in terms of the number of human contacts that that are going to put them at slightly higher risk for maybe getting COVID, simply because the number of people who are coming through their house or who are meeting with them in a clinical setting. And so trying to reduce that impact as well. And FDA has been very sensitive to that. And it's just an ocean of information they put out around COVID and clinical studies and all this as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think this may be a prediction, but I think our world, med device world, is in some aspects probably going to be forever changed. And I think in some cases it's for the better. Like you mentioned, the remote monitoring, if you go to more the inspection and audits and things like that, I think there will be a virtual component to some of these activities.
Yeah.
And, it's like, you and I are chatting over video. I remember being a kid, and the idea of talking to somebody live over video, I mean, that was reserved for Star Wars and Star Trek. You would have never imagined doing that in real life. So I think there's a lot of benefit to some of those types of things. But, I guess getting back to specific into the IDE realm, maybe we'll explore a little bit. So like 510K, do I have to have clinical data for my 510K? Yes or no?
Maybe.
It depends. That's
yeah. Sorry, it'd be nice if it was clear cut.
When yes, when no.
When yes, when no. It's primarily going to be linked to the risk of the product. So, for instance, for certain types of devices, especially if you're going into the home. So let's say one area that I'm familiar with is hemodialysis. Mm-hmm. So for those kinds of products, if you're in the clinic, FDA will accept bench testing. You might have to do human factors studies, and it's going to be a whole lot of information and testing, and you might have to be engaging, nurses and patients, but not in sort of a formal clinical study to get a product like that into the clinic. But if you're trying to put a device like that in the home, then FDA's expectation is that you run a small clinical study. For other types of products as well, so let's say certain types of stents are going to require them for vascular stents, fairly large studies for certain types of pacing and defibrillating products. And, one product, and panel that I was involved in was for leadless pacemakers, and FDA ended up putting those products on the market after gathering a whole lot of information on their safety and efficacy. So specifically, if it's a new sort of category of device or a significant a departure from the existing technology, you're probably going to need a clinical information. Now, for some of these is going to fall into, let's say, PMA category. So for, let's say, the electrophysiology products, that's going to be your PMA. You're more likely to need clinical for these high risk type products. But even for hemodialysis systems, these aren't PMA products. These are 510K products, but they're still relatively high risk. You're direct access to the vascular system, and significant things can go wrong in some of these kinds of treatments. So you have things like that are high risk, usually electromechanical, products. You might have other kinds of, high risk 510K, type devices as well, where just historically we've dealt with these kinds of products under a, under a 510K paradigm.
Mm-hmm. All right. So next question: all PMA devices require an IDE. True or false?
False.
Yeah.
So there's actually some interesting, I won't go too deep into it, but especially for products, I believe, with other PMAs on the market already as of, let's say, 2000. I might be getting the date a little off here, but FDA can actually leverage other companies' clinical data to put your device on the market. Now, some of that, is going to require some, strong comparator to, that let's say predicate PMA. It's not quite the right way to frame it, but if you're making a sort of, let's call it a generic PMA product, sort of think about it like the drug, avenues. FDA could leverage existing clinical data for devices after a certain cutoff date, and it's prescribed in some FDA guidance actually on this. They can leverage existing clinical data. So even if you would expect clinical data to be required for that type of product, if sufficient information exists, and FDA's used some language around fourth of a kind and stuff like this, then you might not need clinical even for a PMA type product. It's going to be a narrower set of cases than where you need it, but
yeah. Okay. Next, I guess, question for you. So let me make sure I phrase the question. So I have a 510K device, or device that's going to follow a 510K path. Do not need the clinical data to support my submission, but I want it for more market acceptance, investors, whatever the case may be.
Yep. You might need it for reimbursement.
Reimbursement. So there's other scenarios that, even though it may not be required, I'm still might have to do an IDE if I haven't got cleared.
Well, you might need to do a clinical study, but if you don't require the IDE, usually you're going to need to do an IDE if you're going to leverage that clinical information for a marketing submission.
Okay.
So that's really what's going to drive your need, aside from, let's say, significant risk, safety, patient safety considerations. It's going to be, if you're going to be using that data to support a marketing submission, you probably want to be collecting that under an investigational device exemption.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. So I figured we could kind of wrap up today and just give folks a little bit of, I guess, high level what goes into an IDE submission. It is a type of regulatory submission, and folks, I want to direct you to 21 CFR Part 812, I believe, covers all investigational device exemption criteria. So go check that out. But from a high level, David, what goes into an IDE submission?
Yeah, it's going to be Part 81220. I just noticed I've got a typo here. The name and address of the sponsor. So, and this is just laid out. So if you can go search the regulations available online. I used to have a set of these books, on a bookshelf behind me. I don't know what your experience is with this. They used to print a new set of them every year. But you can just go online actually and search for this. If you search that, that text, it should pop it up. And you can look at the detail, and it's actually linked in some of the links. I think we'll go ahead and get to people. But it lays out 12 items that need to be included. And this is the name and address of the sponsor, a report of prior investigations and the current investigational plan, a description of manufacturing, processing, packing, and storage of the device, an example of the investigator agreement, and a list of people who signed it, or a list of investigators who've already signed it, actually, in terms of the submission. Then you need a certification that all investigators who participate in the investigation have or signed it already, or anybody who joins the study will sign it. And then you need a list of the name, address, and chairperson of each IRB that you're engaging with, a list of the participating institutions, if you're selling a device, the amount that you're charging for it, as well as an explanation of why that doesn't constitute commercialization. That's an important piece of information you're going to want to include there. You're also going to need either an environmental assessment or an exclusion. In my experience, usually you can, explain why you qualify for an exclusion, but there might be cases where you would have to do an assessment. You need to include the labeling, and you also need to include information that you're going to give to the subjects in the study, as well as the informed consent documentation, and then any additional information as requested by FDA. And that last bit is really going to be maybe device specific or in response to an inquiry from FDA as you go through. So it's not something necessarily that you provide upfront to them. So that lays out the overall landscape of what you need to give them. And then within 30 days after you submit this, FDA is going to come back to you and give you a decision, either that your study is approved, that your study is approved with conditions, or that your study is disapproved. And they might include some additional elements that you don't have to respond to around study design considerations and future considerations. And a lot of this is laid out in some of what FDA has put together on their website. So a lot of really good resources there. And
I don't, this may be myth, I can't remember. Or I seem to remember that if you submit an IDE submission and you do not hear back from FDA in 30 days, that constitutes de facto approval. Is that still a thing, or was that ever a thing? Do you know? I mean, I'm guessing today we're
technically it is a thing. FDA works.
Would you advise people to do that?
I wouldn't advise you. I mean, technically, you would be within your legal rights to do so in certain circumstances. I mean, FDA is also like they've sent people letters in some instances when they're getting submissions in, and there's some kind of a delay in either the government being closed or there was a massive snowstorm, and they were sending out updates to people, around IDEs and things like this. I mean, I would generally advise you not to just start your study. I mean, technically you could, but FDA goes out of their way to meet this 30-day deadline, and they're aware that if they don't, just from a statutory standpoint, you could just start your study, which is one of the reasons that they will give you an answer within 30 days. Expect that by midnight on day 30, you will get an answer. There are very rare circumstances where that's not the case. So I wouldn't get an itchy trigger finger to move forward without a letter from FDA, because one is coming.
Yeah. All right. So David, I guess to wrap up this kind of high level conversation on IDE, might be good to just give people sort of a typical timeline, how to kind of flow through this. Not that this is, etched in some stone by any stretch, but the timing of events. We've talked about QSubs, we've talked about the contents of IDs, we've talked about scenarios, when, and IRBs and NSRs and SRs and that sort of thing, but maybe help people navigate this process a little bit more succinctly.
Yeah, and just before I forget, because I will otherwise, when we think about disapprovals, FDA is only going to be able to disapprove your study based on patient safety considerations. So back before 2012, FDA would oftentimes disapprove studies based on study design issues, or issues that they believed were going to affect your ability to commercialize the device and get a marketing submission through in the future. But Congress put a stop to that. And so FDA is only able to disapprove you based on patient safety considerations. So keep that in mind. And that's why, I mean, the current letters that FDA sends out are a lot more complicated than they used to be in terms of where different information falls, and they give you extra information in additional sections that aren't really part of the letter. And anyway, so that's part of why is that they will approve the study even if they have concerns with it. They'll let you know what those concerns are, but that doesn't preclude you from starting the study. It might preclude you from getting the device on the market on the back end, which means for all intents and purposes,
you're kind of wasting everybody's time.
Even if you get an approval, if you get a bunch of study design considerations, you're probably waiting to start the study until you resolve those in most cases.
Okay.
But in terms of timeline, so to get back to your actual question, you're gonna generally want to go in with a presub or a QSub, as we've talked about, to FDA, and just put this in front of them. Get them a picture of the device and a little bit of detail about what you're looking to study. So if you know that you're headed down that route earlier on in the process, it usually takes about 70 days, maybe let's call it 60 days from when it's received by FDA for you to get a meeting on. I generally recommend that. Try to schedule a meeting with FDA, try to have an actual teleconference with them, or an in-person meeting if we get back to doing that, again here in the future, and just have an opportunity to talk through what it is that your plans are for development, what it is that your plans are for, let's say, a study, and any protocol questions you might have, because this is the opportunity that FDA is gonna have to give you their input, their feedback, and you can hopefully head off any major issues or concerns that might come up.
So before we kind of move to that next major chunk from a timeline perspective, how early is too early to do a pre-submission? I'll cram two parts into this question. And is my Q submission, is there a difference between a 510K Q submission and an IDE Q submission, or can these sort of all be blended together?
You can kind of blend some of this stuff together. I would generally try to separate it out. to some extent. I mean, you can ask questions about the study and questions about the device, or questions about the, sort of the, your planned, approach to commercializing the product within one, QSub.
Okay.
It kind of depends on where you're at in your timeline. I generally recommend there's not really a too early time. As long as you've got some information, I generally recommend pictures. See if you can get pictures, maybe even samples of prototypes or something in front of FDA. I mean, that kind of stuff, if you're able to, to get that to them, can be, and as long as you're not creating some hazard because you've got sharps or, some issue, you're sending them needles, but, if you can get something, a sample of some mechanism of the, the product, or at least getting some diagrams and pictures, and if you can, try to use color. I mean, just little things about it. It's less about.
I mean, you're telling a story in a pre-submission.
Yeah.
I mean, so
absolutely.
I mean, who wants to watch a boring story or listen to a boring story? Spice it up a little. I mean, be factual, but tell a story that's compelling.
Yeah, and some of it is try to tell the, the human interest side of it to, to some extent, because while FDA doesn't consider that, let's say formally, look, I mean, we're all human, and so if you can tell a compelling story about why you're doing what you're doing, you can really get some advocates on your side within FDA to help you drive things forward, and they're going to be more inclined to spend more time and effort getting you good advice and good information. They're going to be doing that in any case, but it's going to help you, I think, if you can tell a compelling story. So definitely, yeah, that storytelling aspect is a big piece of this pre-sub, QSub interaction. And I would also suggest, as I have it, before, that you find an image, or you find a diagram or something that is going to remain consistent as best you can imagine into the future, that you can reproduce every time you put something in front of FDA, because it's something for them to latch on to, because they see so many of these submissions, that if you can give them a point of reference,
almost like the brand, so to speak, right?
Yep, exactly. And that, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I remember this product, and it'll help smooth things along if there are people who've already been involved in previous interactions, especially because for some of these, you might have a pre-submission interaction with FDA years before you actually start the IDE study. I mean, hopefully you can move things along faster than that, but knowing how this sometimes goes, various reasons you get derailed, or anyway, so
slow pivot, whatever the case may be. Yeah, I mean, I think that's not quite a given necessarily, but it's probably more common than not that time between your pre-sub and time between your actual IDE is going to be a while. Even if, I mean, even for me, something I did yesterday, if I have to sometimes go to my calendar and like, what did I do? So,
did I take notes on this meeting?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All right. So pre-sub, and then time passes, and then what happens?
So then you get to your actual original IDE submission, and you might even get to a point where you do a follow-on pre-submission. So it depends on maybe what's happened. Usually you want to interact with FDA and figure out what you're doing in your preclinical work, because there's certain bench data and maybe animal testing you're going to need before you go into human subjects. And FDA can help you work that sort of plan out. And based on what happens, usually it doesn't go quite to plan. In my experience, I mean, maybe there's some people out there that they planned it out and it went exactly as they thought it would. Go ahead, just submit the IDE, but potentially do a follow-on, Q submission interaction just ahead of doing an IDE. Make sure you build it into your plan, maybe a couple months ahead of doing the formal IDE submission, just to iron out any additional questions you might have now that you've got all your data. You're working on assembling the package, but you have a little bit of time where you can get some information to FDA before you have everything really ready in terms of the protocol. You're lining up your study sites. You're doing a lot of this work in the background. Do an interaction with FDA, and then get this formal original IDE study submitted. And that's going to need all these pieces that we talked about. That's going to need your investigational protocol, some details on the device description as part of that. You're going to need details on your manufacturing and You're going to need the information that you're going to be presenting to your study subjects and your informed consent, and anticipate as FDA goes through, like, I don't know, usually dozens, if not hundreds of pages, usually hundreds of pages in a submission like this. They're probably going to come back with changes. So be careful about going to the presses with a bunch of, let's say, physical printed, documents and things. If you can hold back, you can do some stuff printing at risk, but just anticipate you might have to reprint, sections of this after FDA reviews it and asks you to change a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, in those scenarios, I mean, especially those early stages, I highly recommend the print on demand type of situation. And it doesn't have to be a nice trifold glossy sort of thing. I mean, it can be 8.5 by 11. And this type of scenario, it's more about the content, but there will be changes to that. I mean, I almost, would guarantee that.
It's almost a certainty that something will change, but yeah.
Okay. And then,
and then FDA within 30 days of that and expect, so the timing of your submission matters. So I would generally recommend avoid Thanksgiving, avoid Christmas, avoid, I don't know, if the government is shutting down, like, just see if you can avoid some of these kinds of things, because the longer FDA has to review your submission, the more likely you are to have some interactive back and forth and successfully get to an approval without FDA putting basically your study on hold with a disapproval letter or an approval with conditions that has conditions that you basically mean you're not starting the study. So, the timing of the submission matters. It shouldn't. I appreciate that, but just practically it does, because if FDA will get you an answer within 30 days, but if they have less time, that means they're going to more likely have questions that make it to you in their formal letter than if they've got a little bit more time. Maybe they can have a couple more interactive back and forths, resolve some issues, even if the letter you get is smaller. I mean, I see that as a win in many cases, just to reduce the number of questions.
And I think another thing, hopefully this is obvious, but if you're going to submit information to FDA, that's not the time for you now to go on vacation for a couple of weeks and be unavailable.
You need to be available. Well, you might be able to submit it and go on vacation for a week.
Yeah.
I would try to do it the second week, submit it, make sure it actually makes it in, then take off for a week, but then be back for those last 2 weeks. And even then your point is well taken. It's like, definitely in those last 2 weeks and probably the full 30 days, FDA might be reaching out to you for stuff. And if you can quickly turn it around and get something to them in a timely way, you're going to improve the odds that you get your submission through as an approved IDE.
Sure. All right. So what are the last what are the last couple of steps that come to mind as far as the IDE process?
Yeah, so the next piece here is you're going to get a formal letter from FDA, and it's going to be sent by email. You're going to get, to your submission correspondent, get details on, what FDA's concerns are, if they have them, or that you're approved or approved with conditions. Probably there are items that FDA is going to want you to address. In most cases, you're almost never going to get a clean approval. Now, you might get a clean approval with future considerations, things for you to think about. Maybe they flagged that you need some additional testing endpoints for your actual, marketing submission. But usually you're then going to be in a position, maybe 50% of the time, and I haven't actually looked at the 2020 numbers. FDA publishes numbers on how many submissions they approve just outright, how many get an approval with conditions, and how many are disapproved, and sort of the number of iterations and how that overall landscape looks for all of their IDEs. But in a number of cases, you're going to have an amendment. So you're disapproved. Let's say 25% of the time you get disapproved. Something in that ballpark might be higher, might be lower, depending on the device type. But in some of the cases, FDA is going to disapprove the study. you're going to have to come back with an amendment, additional information to address FDA's concerns. If you get an approval, that follow-up is going to be a supplement potentially to address their their concerns. And then you're going to get into and this is probably happening in parallel, where you're enrolling your sites, you're identifying your investigators, doing all this work. Some of that you can be doing before you get the approval. It's just whatever you already have assembled on that, you would submit to FDA, but you don't actually have to have any sites enrolled when you submit your your study to FDA. It would be, but oftentimes you will. So you could submit it without any sites enrolled. You could submit it with some, but not all of your sites enrolled, and you'll be following up with additional information, in the future. So that whole bit around enrollment of sites and at least getting them ready, even though you can't initiate the investigation yet, getting all that lined up and ready can be going on in parallel.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
One of the biggest timeframes that you're going to run into are actually issues around the IRB schedules and getting on there. I think about it as a docket, for review, but that's going to be one of the biggest challenges that you're going to have is less actually your interactions with FDA from talking with a lot of people running clinical studies. Your bigger hurdles actually with the IRBs and getting through that piece of it. So
Can I add a couple things to there?
Yeah, please.
My experience, even the lead up to all of this, it seems like you have sites that are engaged. It sounds like, or you get this impression or this feeling that enrollment is going to be a breeze once you get going. That's rarely the case. Enrollment's probably going to go slower than you think, and the site engagement and getting them onboarded and active is probably going to be a little bit more challenging than you think too, even if they are experienced with doing these sorts of things.
Yeah, and the more you can get lined up, I mean, some of it is you don't want to enroll, let's say, sites too far ahead of enrolling patients, because then maybe they lose interest and all this. But if you can get some of that lined up, and then you can be doing your submission to FDA, and then in most cases you're going to get an approval, fairly early on in that whole process. But you're going to want to build in a buffer of time where you can address study design considerations and these kinds of things, and then tweak any of the documentation you need to engage with the sites on and update your procedures and processes, and maybe your exclusion criteria for subjects and these kinds of things if FDA has some comments around all that. But so you have a lot of work in, let's say, getting to initiating the study at that point, and some of that engagement with FDA is probably happening simultaneously.
Sure.
And then you get to a point where 6 months after your approval, you then have to start submitting reports to FDA about your investigator list. Now you can get a waiver from FDA for certain details in terms of notifying them when you add a site, but then you have to let them know once you've enrolled all of your sites. So there's certain things that you can build into your submission to reduce some of the burden and reporting on the back end, but it's going to be tedious. Just expect running an IDE study is going to be tedious and a lot of paperwork, and you really want to have somebody involved in that who knows what
Yeah, I think that's an important thing about this is it's not like you get the permission to do so and then it's like, see you later. I mean, there's still culpability or responsibility to have that back and forth dialogue or communication with FDA. So I think that's really key. I think a lot of times people forget about that.
Yeah, and you're going to have to then, if you change the device, if you change your protocol, you're going to need to submit a supplement. You're also going to need to provide reports on annual progress. So every 12 months, you're going to need to give FDA an update. You're also going to need to identify, any unanticipated adverse events in a report to FDA, depending on how serious that is. You've got different, reporting, expectations around, the timelines for this, and then you're going to be providing investigator lists, and eventually you're going to get to the stage where you're done with the study and you're going to submit a final report. But I would caution you, be careful about closing out your IDE study too early. Usually It depends. Sometimes you might close your IDE study and then do your marketing submission. Oftentimes, you might want to keep the investigational device exemption study open and continue your follow-up while your marketing submission goes into FDA, because sometimes they might come back and say, we really want 5 more subjects.
Right. That's a
Or
good point
something
too.
like this.
No, that's a really good point too. It's been a day or two, but I remember scenarios, and then if you closed it, now you got to go back.
You got to go back to the drawing board. It's a lot easier if you've got the study still open, still active. You haven't yet submitted your final report. I've seen situations when I was at FDA where we would review the information from the IDE in the marketing submission before we actually reviewed the final report. And then the final report closeout was basically just a formality because we'd already reviewed all the information as part of the marketing submission. You can go either way, and there might be some device groups at FDA that want to see it one way or the other, or they might take issue with that. But it does, especially if there's any possibility that FDA is going to want you to go collect more clinical data, or they're not happy with the number of subjects. It's a lot easier to modify an existing approved study than to open a new one, even though practically it should be, sort of a comparable level of effort. You've already got the documentation, but just logistically, it's a lot more complicated.
For sure. All right. Anything else that's important about the IDE timeline and process before we?
I think that mostly covers it. I mean, the regulations suggest that within 3 months after termination, of your study, that you need to be submitting that, final IDE report. So think about that in terms of how you're structuring your, your study and how you're thinking about definitions of what, termination or completion of the investigation actually looks like, where maybe, see if you can get yourself some flexibility on that sort of termination completion. And then, you can sort of delay, let's say, the, the closure and final IDE report to FDA and the IRBs. That mostly covers it, I think, in terms of timelines and content. It's a lot of information.
There's a ton.
You could spend days probably reading documents and watching videos, and that's assuming that you know what you're looking at, to begin with.
It's so true. I mean, and I liked your point earlier when I was mentioning Greenlight Academy, and I'll talk to you after the episode. Maybe we can figure out a couple of different learning paths that we can put out there. But maybe we can explore that, because I think, to your point, I mean, there is a large quantity and volume of information, but just figuring out which parts and pieces of that and how to navigate that. I mean, you and I know what we're looking for when we go to the FDA website. If you're a layperson, it's
good luck.
Good luck, yeah. Call Mr. Regulatory. Go to mrregulatory.com. David Pudwill, thank you so much for being the guest and talking about IDE today. We'll have you back to talk about something else regulatory related here real soon. So thank you so much. And
thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And folks, again, mrregulatory.com, mrregulatory.com. Go to YouTube, watch the videos, Mr. Regulatory, amazing stuff, really helpful to learn more about de novos and PMAs and IDEs and all those sorts of things and more. Check it out. And again, Greenlight Guru, we're here to help you with your medical device quality needs, helping you through design controls, risk, managing your documents and records and all those quality events that happen, such as complaints and CAPAs. Go to www.greenlight.guru to learn more about the Greenlight Guru Medical Device Success Platform. I'd love to have a conversation, understand your needs and requirements, and see if there might be an opportunity to help you. As always, thank you so much for listening to and now watching the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host and founder at Greenlight Guru, Jon Speer, and you have been listening to the Global Medical Device Podcast.